I'm Andy with Echo Zoe Ministries, and thanks again for joining me for another edition of Lessons in Logic. I just went over red herring fallacies, and so now the next fallacy I'm going to discuss would fall in what I discussed in that last session, that red herring would be both a fallacy itself, but also a category of fallacies. So this one we're going to talk about is another that would fall within that category of red herring, and that is the straw man. So let's talk about the straw man fallacy. Straw man, the way this fallacy works is that in this case of arguing in a debate type setting, a person will change or exaggerate an opponent's position in such a way that it's easier to refute them than the actual position. A straw man is a very well-known, famous fallacy. A lot of people are familiar with it, but if you can't argue with what the person's actually saying, just construct something that's superficially similar, that kind of sort of sounds like what they're saying, but it's easier to attack or to mock, and then go after that instead. An example would be, again, I pointed out that I'm recording these in an election season. It's midterm elections here in the United States, but one side of our political spectrum would say that we want a smaller and more limited government. And so then the other side might respond to that by saying, well, your view is no different than having no government at all. So there certainly is a difference between small and limited government, where government does what it's designed and obligated to do, versus not having a government at all. Conversely, we'll see the other side who says, well, we want a little bit more government. The government is capable of doing some of those basic things, but maybe they can do a little bit more for people too. And one way that we can refute that using a straw man fallacy, which is to not actually refute it, but to argue against it, would be to say, well, you're no different than totalitarian governments, because you want to do everything, and it's not the government's role to do those things. So again, whether you're on more of the libertarian side versus the big government side, just be careful about how you argue against the other side, that you actually argue what they're saying. And it's also important to recognize that sometimes the people that are in government positions, or the politicians running for government positions, will use these type of fallacious ways of thinking to their advantage, and they'll argue that, well, most people know that I'm not a totalitarian, I'm for bigger government, I'm not a totalitarian, and then maybe he is a totalitarian, but he wants you to think that he's just a typical nanny state type person who wants the government to do the basics, but also wants the government to do a little bit more. And so they will cloud their own views with the fallacious way of thinking. And so it's not always necessarily a fallacy, but you need to watch out. And this is just one example. This is and I'm going to be using a lot of political examples, because politics is very, very easy to pick out from, because there's just so much fallacious argumentation going on. But watch out for that when you see political argumentation, that you're careful that if you're gonna argue for or against a particular view, especially if you're arguing against a particular view, that you argue against the view itself and not against a superficially similar but practically different view than what another person actually believes. So here's a straw man example that I pulled several years ago from a Dilbert comic strip, where the main characters in Dilbert are Dilbert, who in that the first box there on the upper left, he's on the right side of the table there. That's our main character, Dilbert. And then the furthest from him is pointy-haired boss, and the guy in between them both is Wally. Wally has a reputation for being lazy. He doesn't actually work. But in this case, While he tells his boss that he didn't accomplish anything this week, which we could expect because he doesn't work, because he was going through certification. And he's just thinking to himself, don't ask, don't ask, don't ask. So, but the boss does ask, certification for what? And so then he starts thinking to himself, okay, let's move on to plan B. Let's mount a passionate defense against an argument that was not made. So he starts screaming at his boss. Well, how can you say that certification is a waste of time? Without certification, management would be reduced to randomness. Sorry, I can't quite see it really well from the other side of the room here, so bear with me there. But do you think you'd be happier just guessing who is qualified to do what, or do you? And then of course the boss finishes with something's wrong with you. But you can see the fallacy that he's using here is that it isn't like what did you do, but why are you attacking certification? Which the boss never did. So a straw man that we see in Scripture early on is from Genesis 3:1, the second half of the verse, where the serpent turns and says to the woman, "Indeed, has God really said that you shall not eat from the fruit of any tree in the garden?" And of course, that's not what God said. God did not say you shall not eat from any tree. He just said that tree. Don't eat from that tree. And so the serpent got Eve fooled by confusing what God really said. So be careful for that. We see that also in Scripture. And again, that's from our Lessons in Logic series. If you want to get the whole series, there is the URL where you can get the entire series that we did a few years ago on logic. And until next time, thank you for joining me for Lessons in Logic on the Straw Man.